Last week I spoke to 6 different brands about sustainability, all from completely different industries, all different size businesses, B2B and B2C. The same content patterns about sustainability kept coming up. My name's Peter Roby and I make complex and uncomfortable topics really easy to talk about. These brands covered lots of different industries. There was a large electronics retailer, food industry, a couple of little local brands, as well as a large clothing retailer, and manufacturing across our household goods. All very identifiable brands that everyone would know. Some had sustainability teams and marketing teams. Some were just one person. One large electronics retailer I spoke to was just a single person marketing person. What struck me with all of these brands was how advanced their sustainability practices are. It's fascinating to hear where they'd started and where they've gone to in this journey. But the pattern that keeps coming forward is that this journey that they've got doesn't match the visibility or the exposure that they are already talking about. And that's from the small brands right up to the big brands. In every single case, in fact, when I think back even over the last year, every single brand that's coming to us pretty much is looking to talk about exposure. That's coming to Meridian Green to talk about exposure. But when we start jumping into, well, what's your visibility on? What have you done in the past? How have you talked about sustainability before? The visibility and exposure doesn't match the journey of sustainability that they've done. And that's what I wanted to talk to about today. Some of the sustainability practices that these brands are putting in place are actually quite fascinating, and we all need to know about it. If you knew that there was an electronics company out there that was doing in-store recycling on even the smallest things like headphones and little electronics, things that you would normally think, oh, I'll just put this in the bin. If you knew that these items were being collected and at scale, this turns into tons and tons of small electronics. They're being disassembled, they're being pulled apart, and they're being recycled. But further than that, they're actually now looking at how to design that recycling back at the beginning so that there isn't as much plastic or there isn't as many different products. And I find that fascinating. It's always interesting hearing when companies or businesses are talking about their recycling, how they're reducing the number of different components and different types of materials that are built into that product, so that at the end, when it's been recycled, it makes it a whole lot easier. That I think is quite fascinating. I think that's something that consumers need to know about. So if you've got a brand that is not quite sure how to talk about your sustainability practice, just the simple fact of saying we've designed recycling into our product at the beginning so that when it comes time to pull it apart at the end of life, it makes it a whole lot easier. That I think is quite fascinating. And in this case, with this particular electronics, it's in store, but you only know about it when you go into the store. That's not being promoted as part of a reason to buy. And I think this all keeps coming back to this system of sustainability is built in order to improve, but marketing is about selling something. And if we can find a way to bring both of those systems back together, marketing and sustainability working together, that's where I feel like there's huge gains to be made in talking about with content. We've got consumers that will buy just from the fact of knowing that something can be better recycled. That's already a powerful piece of content. It doesn't matter how it happens and how you go about it and what happens behind the scenes. That doesn't matter. The fact that you actually have a program in place and you're doing that, I feel like that is a great piece of content and great to hear how that is working. This industry-leading work is often invisible to customers. And that's one of my main points I wanted to get across today, is the pattern that we often see, regardless of a big brand down to a small brand. I've just given an example of a big brand. A small brand, I'm just thinking about one of the small brands I spoke to, a little local brewing company, and I made a point over the last year of speaking to lots of little brewers to see whether they were doing the same thing. And they are. There seems to be a common theme amongst little brewers doing food recycling through the brewing process. So this might be taking locally excess food and finding a way to put that through the brewing process. It might be excess food waste, it might be excess potato pulp, it might be bread, all of that can be used as a material in the brewing process. I find that fascinating. I think viewers would find that fascinating. It's the sort of thing that you'd see on a TikTok. But why are so many customers invisible to that? And why is marketing not wanting to talk about that? And that, I feel, is again part of marketing and sustainability coming together. Great initiatives are buried inside stretch teams. And this pattern just keeps coming up over and over. More of a how do we talk about it? How do we market this in a way of being able to still make sales targets? The teams that we're speaking with are across the board. One-person team to many people within the team. A sustainability team sitting with a marketing team. Junior teams, senior teams. It's across the board. It's extensive from the small brands to the big brands. The main pattern that seems to be coming through is the obvious desire to want to push out content. But the roadblock I seem to see a lot of is there's not a lot of goals in how that content is being produced. And a lot of the content needs to be talking about brand amplification rather than about maybe a sustainability gain, and going about, look at the innovations that we're doing, and that indirectly can also sell and amplify your product very well. And having people talk about that, it's a huge plus. Another strong pattern that seems to come through is how a brand wants to move faster and talk about their sustainability, but their industry does not. I'm reminded a good example of that would be, and I can't tell the brand, but let's talk about the industry. In this particular industry, it's about choosing at the moment whether a product is well made or whether it's easier to recycle. What's a good example of that? If a product is really well made, then it's often harder to recycle at its end of life. But does that mean that it lasts longer? So therefore, the marketing around that particular product is saying it's the longest life. We don't need to send it to landfill as often. But when it comes time to recycle, it's much harder to shred that up or to pull it apart. And so in this particular case, this particular industry, most of the brands within this industry are producing items that are easy to recycle, but therefore the product isn't very good to start with. And so therefore the product needs to be turned over more. Great for a profit, and great to be able to say this is the easiest item to recycle, but it doesn't last very long. And so I was speaking with a brand that was saying, we're not ready to talk about sustainability. We're one of our brand leaders. We lead our stewardship in our council and in our industry by having an item that is really well made, and we're now having to find we've now got to produce the shredders and the way to pull this item apart at its end of life, but our industry isn't ready to talk about that. And they were talking about how they need government policy to help along the way. I think that's a great example of an industry that's saying, how do we question recyclability versus strength of a product? And look, at the moment, maybe there's no answer for that until government policy comes along, but there's still a great story there to be able to talk about with sustainability content. I think even just posing that question, we've got a great product, it lasts the longest, but it also makes it harder to recycle. What do you want as a consumer? What are you prepared to pay for as a consumer? And I think that's a great talking point. And talking about the materials that go into it and how this particular company has reduced the types of materials that have gone into this product so that it's easier to recycle at the other end, as well as being a good product at the beginning. There's lots of examples of how policy is lagging the momentum of sustainability. There are filming constraints when talking about mining. I've worked in mining for the better part of almost 3 decades, and there are many brands who are doing things across the board with some of Australia's largest mining resources and infrastructure sites, but they're constrained by how friendly those sites are in order to come in and film and talk about a particular product. So there might be it may not be a product, it might be a way of doing things, a process, and that's been simplified and innovated, but the mine site themselves say, we're not allowing externals to come in, or they want a whole lot more control over how that how that story and how that narrative comes out at the other end. And I see that all the time. We often are going to mine sites that are friendly rather than going to mine sites that have a lot more innovation attached to it and a lot more gain. And in both cases, that's something that I think people want to hear about. I find more and more that we're being asked by the brand managers that are coming to us, how do we involve the consumer more? How can we, rather than present our product or our innovation, how can we involve them more in the challenge? And so I'm finding now that the content we're producing is more about challenging the consumer. What are you prepared to do? And how are you, and just presenting the challenge to the consumer and letting the consumer decide. I think the actual innovation comes through once you start talking about that. And this then circles back to the ongoing pattern of challenge within our systems right now is talking about how do marketing and sustainability sit side by side when those two systems aren't designed to work together. By the end of last week, after I'd been through half a dozen meetings, I was starting to see that the pattern of stalling by talking about sustainability was actually sitting behind the work that's been done. I actually even had one brand say that they were hesitant to want to make any claims. I sort of disagree with that. I don't see that you're making a claim about something. I see about just putting out, this is the journey we're on. This is where we've got to. Look at the work that we've done. Whether government policy has caught up or whether government policy is sitting behind, whether the whole industry is behind that or not, that doesn't really matter. I think that marketing and sustainability can sit side by side. It's made me rethink why sustainability conversations are stalling when everyone in the room is actually doing the work.